Welcome, everyone, to the New York Browning Society. It's glad to have such a nice turnout on such a stormy day, as they say. I'm still waiting for the rain. What do we think on the Astros-Yankees game? They going to put it off? Go Nationals. Go Reds. That's a So we have a fantastic performance put together for you guys today. This is actually the opening of our 2019-2020 schedule. We go all the way till the month of May, so from October to May, we come and meet here every month, and we've been doing so consecutively for over 110 years officially. We are 110 years meeting together. We started this club in, what would that make it? 1907. So we actually have been here 114 years, right? 114 years. That's a long time for a literary society to be meeting every month. And I just want to thank everybody for coming out and supporting the society. The one thing that I would also like to thank is Miss Jennifer Silverstein. She's brought out all these kids from Clinton High School. She made a transfer from Gramercy Arts to Clinton High School, which is on 15th Street, so we keep it local with the high schools. And it's such an amazing thing. Thank you guys for all making it out. Are you guys excited for a literary talk? All right, great. Let's give a round of applause for everybody showing up today. Hopefully we can keep this on the regular. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We have a great schedule lined up for this year. So let me introduce our speaker, Tom DiEgidio. He is actually a member of our directors here at the Browning Society. We voted him in at the May luncheon last year, so it's glad to have him a part of the Browning Society officially. He just released a new book entitled The Enigma of Arrival. I don't know if he has some copies available. It was published with Underground Books this year. I really like the bio that he has in this book, so I'm going to read this to describe Tom. It almost starts out like a Fresh Prince of Bel-Air episode. Native West Philadelphian, born and raised. No, it doesn't say born and raised. Native West Philadelphian Tom DiEgidio was born a bastard as a Tancio di Felice in the old St. Vincent's orphanage, since torn down. He wrote poetry from age 11 until 1977, where his poems were stolen. In 1981, Tancio di Felice founded the Sierra de Felice Gallery in Soho. He helped shoot plus appear in the Emmy Award-winning HBO cult film The Art of Failure, about painter Chuck Connolly and the 80s art scene here in New York City. Ubu.com has digitally republished the 1984 EP Dutton volume, The Art of Performance, opening with Tancio de Felice's groundbreaking essay, Renaissance Performance. As of 1984, and who says the powers that be don't have a sixth sense of humor, after a 9-year career as a paid published writer, Tancio de Felice mysteriously ceased appearing in print. In 1999, he happened to assume his father's family name, selling 3 feature articles, Seduced in Bologna, Leo Castelli, and Did Adam and Eve Have Navels? To Salon.com as Tom DiEgidio, before quickly again ceasing being published. Hopefully his reemergence as a poet with Underground Books represents a turnaround in his stymied career as a published writer. Tom DiEgidio has lived in Manhattan, San Francisco, Rome, and Quito, Ecuador. He serves on the board of the New York Browning Society. He is at work on a memoir provisionally titled Basquiat Requiem. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm round of applause for Tom DiEgidio.
Okay. All right. This talk is mainly about 2 people, and they're both portrayed in this cartoon by Max Beerbohm. The little white-haired guy is Robert Browning, and the tall artist is Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was also a poet as well as a painter. And Well, anyway, you get some idea of, sort of what they looked like. That's Robert Browning. That's his portrait that's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And it shows him at approximately the age he was when he first met Dante Gabriel Rossetti, middle-aged. My talk is called Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Robert Browning, A Pair of Harlots, and the Fleshly School of Poetry. A talk in 3 chapters and 1 postscript. Chapter 1, Rossetti reaches out. It was on an evening in 1855 London that Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Robert Browning first met on one of Browning's visits from Florence, where he resided with his far more famous poet wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It was when Robert Browning began to be perceived as being somewhere on the poetic map, the year when his collection, Men and Women, was first published. Rossetti, still only 27 years old, was known as an artist and founder of an art movement with the odd name of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. His poetry at that point was reserved strictly for his family and close friends. For most of those present, Tennyson's reading of his Maude that evening was undoubtedly the highlight of that soiree held at Browning's temporary residence on London's Dorset Street. But the young Rossetti the dashing young Rossetti, as he looked at that time here in his own self-portrait, the young Rossetti was wholly enthralled to the then far less celebrated Browning, who read his Fra Lippo Lippi to the gathering. Browning's line from Fra Lippo Lippi, "Take away love, and our earth is a tomb," may well have come to haunt him just a few years later when he went into irreversible decline upon the death of his young wife. Fra Lippo Lippi would be published later that year of 1855 as part of Men and Women, the 2-volume collection seen today as a great turning point in Browning's poetic career, containing such classic Browning poems, in addition to Fra Lippo Lippi, as Love Among the Ruins, Andrea del Sarto, A Toccata of Galuppi's, Bishop Blougram's Apology, Two in the Campagna, and Child Roland to the Dark Tower came. At the time, however, it was seen as no such thing, coming under attack from the most influential tastemakers of the English-speaking world. Matthew Arnold had already characterized Browning's poetry as, quote, a confused multitudinousness. Now the other highly influential cultural critic of the day, John Ruskin, referred not at all flatteringly to Browning's breakthrough collection as, quote, a mass of conundrums. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was still very much viewed as wearing the poetic pants in the family. And when her Aurora Leigh appeared just 1 year later in 1856, Ruskin declared it the greatest poem of the century. Though barely perceptible even to Browning at the time, it was the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood under the leadership of Rossetti that was beginning to educate a literary world that could not penetrate Browning's highly experimental poetic shorthand, which it saw as guttural, harsh, strange, and obscure to the point of unintelligibility. Whether he fully knew it or not, Browning, on that summer evening in 1855 London, already owed a clear debt of gratitude to his first and still largely only major fan, the 27-year-old Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Elizabeth Barrett Browning sat on the sofa next to Tennyson as he read his poem, Maude. That's Tennyson reading Maude on that evening, as sketched from life by Rossetti on that occasion. Rossetti sketched that because his own wife, Lizzie, that's Lizzie, was one of those starstruck by Tennyson. Rossetti sketched Tennyson as he read as a gift for Lizzie. Across the top of Rossetti's sketch is scrawled a line from Tennyson's Maude, written there that evening by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So this is a relic, a souvenir, if you will, of that historic meeting between Rossetti and Robert Browning. Although this was the occasion of their first encounter in the flesh, they had been in communication with each other ever since the teenage Rossetti came across Browning's anonymous early poem, Pauline, in 1847, deduced its authorship, and wrote a fan letter to Browning in Florence asking for corroboration. Rossetti's astute detective work was possible because he was already one of Browning's few early admirers, and his own adolescent poetic production was very much in imitation of Browning. Nor was it just poetry that Browning inspired in the young Rossetti, whose very first watercolor was based upon Browning's 1844 poem, The Laboratory, when Rossetti was only 16 years old. And that's Rossetti's watercolor, The Laboratory, based on Browning's poem of the same name. At a time when Browning's Sordello was routinely denounced and ridiculed for its supposed incomprehensibility by Tennyson, Ruskin, and other not exactly minor members of the English literary establishment, Rossetti regularly drove his fellow members of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the artistic movement he had largely launched, to the point of abstraction by subjecting them to 50 pages at a time of his passionate recitations of Sordello. Someone once joked that it was having to listen to Sordello that caused the breakup of the pre-Raphaelite On the surface, there might seem to be much in common to bind Rossetti and Browning together. Both were fascinated by Italy, Italian art, literature, and culture. But while Browning lived much of his life in Florence and then Venice, Rossetti, product of a cultured Italian-speaking household in London, never set foot in Italy even once. Both men became relatively young widowers. Their wives, both of them Elizabeths, dependent upon opiates. Tincture of opium known as laudanum in the case of Rossetti's wife, Lizzie. Morphine in the case of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The two wives died within a few months of one another. But while Browning increasingly became a social butterfly following his Elizabeth's demise, Rossetti withdrew, gradually becoming a virtual hermit, only occasionally leaving his house, and then usually at night, and obsessed with the image of his late wife, dead from an overdose, whom he portrayed as Dante's Beatrice, the beloved, his namesake Dante, enshrined in the Divine Comedy. By the time Browning wrote a letter of condolence to Rossetti in early 1862, the two poets had been friends for 15 years. Of the two, Rossetti might be said to have had the more likely background for a poet, as evidenced also by the career of his poet sister, Christina Rossetti. And this shows Christina Rossetti with her brother Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Browning's father was a banker, albeit one who loved literature. Rossetti's father was the minor Italian poet and noted Dante scholar, Gabriele Rossetti, who held the professorship in Italian at King's College, London. Of ancient noble stock, Gabriele Rossetti had been born and raised in the family's decayed medieval fortress. On the outskirts of the town of Vasto, in the mountainous Abruzzo region of central Italy, known for its tales of werewolves and vampires. It is the region where Browning's beloved master Shelley set his gory drama of incest and murder, the Cenci. A local prince, just to give you an idea of the some of the local color there in Abruzzo, a local prince, Di Sangro, who was born in the 1700s, the same as Dante Gabriel's father, was the local alchemist who used the privileges of being a feudal prince to experiment allegedly upon living people who were the serfs on his estate. And these were produced supposedly while the subjects were still alive, because all their veins and so forth are intact. The princely Rossettis had seen better days. So Gabriele allowed himself to be taken to the royal Bourbon court at Naples by the Marquis of Vasto, who happened to be in command of the royal palace. There, Gabriele wrote a poem dedicated to Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, sister of the late beheaded Queen Marie Antoinette of France. In return, he was put in charge of the royal collection of Greek and Roman antiquities in Naples. But Gabriele bit the hand that fed him and helped found the secret revolutionary society of the Carbonari, a deadly association given to assassinating both its political enemies and its own members who were failing to measure up. Think of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, in its heyday. With the Carbonari, he plotted to overthrow the Bourbon monarchy and the Pope and establish a united Italy with what was then widely regarded as a radical form of government, namely a democratic republic with no monarch as at the head. Exile for him in England was the result. Another influence on Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poetic vocation was his maternal uncle, Giovanni Polidori, the same Polidori who was an intimate friend of Lord Byron and of the Shelleys. And you can see Rossetti's uncle. He's the third figure there. The four of them, these four, spent the summer of 1818 together in a villa on Lake Geneva, where Mary Shelley produced Frankenstein. And Polidori wrote a precursor to Dracula called The Vampire. Shelley was Robert Browning's poetic god, and this Rossetti family connection with his idol certainly added luster to Dante Gabriel's image in Browning's eyes. Although Rossetti made 3 trips to continental Europe, he never set foot in Italy, even though he lived 2 decades past the fall of the Bourbons from power. Nor did his sister Christina ever visit the Italy about which she wrote passionate poems. Ironically, it may very possibly have been the vengeful secret society of the Carbonari his own father helped found that he feared. Unlike Mazzini, Garibaldi, and other leaders of the Risorgimento movement that so powerfully captured the imaginations of the English intelligentsia, including Robert Browning, and inspired one of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's most ambitious of poems, Casa Guidi Windows, Gabriele Rossetti did not return from exile to fight the good fight for Italian unification and democracy. Obviously, he had let the clandestine society of the Carbonari down. A member of the Carbonari attempted to assassinate French Emperor Napoleon III, a Carbonari member who was seen to be betraying the secret society's democratic ideals. The theme of the Carbonari exacting vengeance upon its own was taken up by Wilkie Collins in his popular 1860 novel, The Woman in White, in which the evil Count Fosco gets away with his crimes until done in by the secret society he'd betrayed. So maybe it's more accurate to view Browning and Rossetti as opposites, with an overlapping interest in Italy, the Brownings eloping from straight-laced Victorian England to a less judgmental Italy, and the Rossettis taking refuge from tumultuous revolutionary Italy in a stable England. Chapter 2, Century of Progress, Vampires, and Ways of Escape. We often think of the 19th century as a period of great propriety and bottled up emotions, as symbolized by a Queen Victoria who was perpetually unamused. It was also an era of society-altering industrialization, liberalizing political movements, and great scientific progress, including such earth-shattering concepts as evolution. It was, not coincidentally, the century of Frankenstein, Dracula, Dorian Gray, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, among other disquieting novels, along with much dark poetry, of which I will mention only Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, and Robert Browning's chillingly gothic Porphyria's Lover, a love poem in which the lover strangles the beloved with her own hair. Like our own time right now, it was an era of unprecedented riches born out of a new kind of economy. And it was, again, just like our time now, a period of great social distortion and warping, to which the common person found it painfully difficult to adapt. W.H. Auden wrote of the 19th century liberal democracy that its hypocritical tolerance for social injustice had, and I quote Auden, created the most impersonal, the most mechanical, and the most unequal civilization the world has ever seen, a civilization torn apart by the opposing emotions born of economic injustice, unquote. This is the overarching theme of Thomas Hardy's novels of an English countryside increasingly destabilized by industrialization. While Charles Dickens created characters like Oliver Twist to exemplify the new sort of urban poor in the increasingly teeming and ever more insalubrious metropolis, filling up with those masses fleeing an evaporating world of bucolic rusticity. And this is a period photograph of some street in London at that time where thousands of families were literally living right on the streets without any. Exactly. They had to close down Parliament at one point because of the smell. The Victorian era's OxyContin was a tincture of opium called laudanum. Its use was widespread, and like today, opiate overdose became a too common problem. Laudanum was one way of attempting to escape. And again, I quote Auden, escape, quote, a civilization torn apart by the opposing emotions born of economic injustice, unquote. Another way of escaping the societal nightmare is exemplified by those like the Brownings, who had enough means to live tolerably well in a still largely pre-industrial Italy, which would do, considering that the England Robert and Elizabeth Browning grew up in, a sort of lingering 18th century England, no longer existed. Charles Dickens, Robert Browning's exact contemporary and friend, reminisces about this jollier English society, so recently disappeared, when he depicts Fezziwig's party in the Christmas Past segment of A Christmas Carol. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, at first anyway, tried a third way to escape the new horrors of English society that were, no doubt unconsciously, inspiring tales of vampires, doppelgangers, and assorted other monsters, much as we've seen zombies take hold in today's popular imagination. Rossetti's solution was to escape into bohemianism in the form of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which seemed to somehow coalesce around him, offering yet another level of escape into the past, into a kind of new Middle Ages as expressed in art and literature. This is a Rossetti painting depicting a female warrior. It happens to be St. Joan of Arc. And it's a reminder of the ways in which the pre-Raphaelite movement continues to influence art and media today, because of course now we have female warriors who are part of very popular television programs. Like Game of Thrones, or you might be familiar with the pre-Raphaelite Victorianism of Penny Dreadful, of which this is a still. Although the actual Brotherhood, like all subsequent art movements, fell apart after just a few years, its influence only grew and spread, having effects on not only painting and literature, but on design, lifestyles, on the impulse to form future art movements of the Cubist or pop varieties. And the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood is much with us today in popular culture. For those who are addicted to the medievalism of Game of Thrones, or the pre-Raphaelite Victorianism of Penny Dreadful. Chapter 3, Death and Degeneration. Drum roll, please. It is fair to say that Dante Gabriel Rossetti had the character of a collector. It was a trait he perhaps inherited from his father Gabriele, who in Italy had collected not just Greek and Roman antiquities, but members for the secret society of the Carbonari. And in his London exile, the numerous fellow political exiles who constantly gathered around the dinner table as young Dante Gabriel was growing up. The adult Dante Gabriel collected many fine and curious objects with which he furnished his London home. More eccentrically, he collected an astounding variety of animals who lived in and around the house, including a humped Indian bull, a kangaroo, and most famously, a wombat. And this is Dante Gabriel's drawing of himself mourning the death of his pet wombat, which he wrote several poems about. Part of one of the poems is there. In addition to his wombat and other exotic animals, Rossetti collected the extraordinary personality and great poet Algernon Charles Swinburne to be part of his collection of exotic beings in his house. This is Swinburne, as portrayed by his good friend Rossetti. And this iconic head by Rossetti clearly points toward the iconic heads created by Andy Warhol a century later. And here's another example of the ways in which the world of Rossetti and the pre-Raphaelites continues to live today, because there's actually a contemporary cartoonist who writes a cartoon about Rossetti and all these people And here we have the wombat again. And that's William Morris, the artist and poet, and Rossetti discussing the wombat. And William Morris's nickname was Topsy, and Rossetti rather teasingly named the wombat after William Morris, who's saying, what the hell is that thing, Rossetti, etc. I mentioned Warhol pointedly. As both men, Rossetti and Warhol had an uncanny ability to bring talented people together and to embody a movement, be it the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood or pop, with ill-defined parameters and enormous influence far beyond the somewhat rarefied worlds of art and literature. Dante Gabriel Rossetti was, above all, a collector of women possessing an exotic beauty, which he captured in his art. Two of his models, Alexa Wilder, who is in this Rossetti painting, and a woman who lived with him for a time, Fanny Cornforth, also portrayed here by Rossetti, were professional prostitutes frequenting London's artistic milieu. Rossetti made these women, including Jane Morris, wife of artist, designer, poet, and fellow pre-Raphaelite brother William Morris, who appears in that cartoon about the wombat, his mistresses. And this is Jane Morris, or Janie, who was also, while being the wife of Morris, was Rossetti's mistress. One day, the 16-year-old Elizabeth Siddal was spotted by Irish poet William Allingham through the window of a London hat shop, where she worked as a lonely assistant. Rossetti, captivated by her greenish-blue eyes, long neck, brilliant complexion, and coppery golden hair, declared her, quote, a stunner, a term he apparently invented. And Lizzie, as she was popularly called, was soon posing for all the pre-Raphaelite painters, most famously, perhaps, for Millet as Ophelia. In Shakespeare's Hamlet. She was a kind of prototype of the supermodel, the ill-fated Edie Sedgwick of her day, who soon became tied to Rossetti, much as Edie became the female counterpart to Andy Warhol. Both women had drug habits that would precipitate their early deaths. Lizzie Siddal showed some talent for making both poems and paintings. In neither field does she rise to the level of the geniuses she suddenly found herself thrust among, but she was making progress in both fields when she died at only 28. And now I'm going to show you one of, and hardly anybody ever sees this stuff, one of Lizzie Siddal's own drawings, and it happens to be based upon Robert Browning's poem, Pippa Passes. Not bad, right? So she's an unrecognized, largely unrecognized artist and poet of the 19th century, ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Siddal Rossetti. And this is a scene from Pippa Passes by Robert Browning. The oft-quoted lines from Pippa Passes, beginning, "God's in his heaven, all's right with the world," show how we can easily sentimentalize a poem about prostitution, adultery, and murder, and more generally sentimentalize the psychically tough times that Browning and Rossetti were living through and are spokesmen for. And coincidentally, just last week, a long-lost love song by John Lennon that he wrote for his wife Yoko Ono was finally released with the lyrics, "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be," which none of the media reports I saw mentioned the connection with Robert Browning. It's on the new Ringo Starr record, and it's from this poem, Pippa Passes, which Elizabeth Siddal is illustrating here. Rossetti married Lizzie Siddal after a decade of concubinage, but they did not grow old together. For less than 2 years into their marriage, Lizzie Siddal OD'd on her drug of choice, laudanum, tincture of opium, probably a suicide, on February 10th, 1862. Lizzie was interred in the Rossetti family crypt in London's Highgate Cemetery, but not before a distraught Rossetti, during the week when she lay in their house in an unsealed coffin, tried to convince her doctor repeatedly to try and revive her, insisting that she was only asleep. Shortly thereafter, when Rossetti's long-planned book of poems, which was to be his first major foray into the literary world, failed to appear as announced, rumors began to spread that the eccentric Dante Gabriel Rossetti had put the only manuscript copy of his book of poems into his wife's coffin when no one was looking. The rumors were proved true. When nearly 8 years later, Rossetti hired some men to dig Lizzie up. On October the 5th, 1869, in secrecy, at night, by the flickering illumination of a graveside fire, the pages of Rossetti's poetry manuscript were recovered from where he'd placed them to serve as a pillow for his dead wife's head. This is one of those manuscript pages recuperated from the grave, from the coffin of Elizabeth Siddal Rossetti. Thus, Rossetti's now perhaps ill-omened collection, called simply Poems, was finally able to be published in 1870. For about a year, the volume garnered uniformly good reviews. Browning sent a congratulatory letter. From a distance, Rossetti, who in reality had never recovered from the death of his wife, had the appearance of leading a charmed life, and no doubt incurring more than a bit of envy. He was recognized as the founder and leader of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which, though no longer an intact group, continued becoming more famous and influential than ever. He was the lover of renowned beauty Jane Morris and other beautiful women whose images appeared in his sought-after paintings, which commanded high prices. He was the literary seer who had championed the long-ridiculed poetry of Robert Browning. And now Browning had finally become acknowledged in the literary world as England's greatest living poet. Finally, Rossetti, while not being entirely accepted as an Englishman, had even become a highly acclaimed English poet, finally taking his place among the poets of the day. When the attack came in 1871, it was hardly a surprise. Rossetti's housemate Swinburne had made a disparaging remark about the deceased young friend of minor poet Robert Buchanan, who then attacked Swinburne in print for his supposedly indecent verse. Here's a Max Beerbohm caricature depicting Swinburne, Michael Rossetti, who was the critic of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, and Dante Gabriel, and they're listening to Swinburne in Rossetti's house reciting one of his new poems, or his supposedly indecent verse. In-house Pre-Raphaelite critic William Rossetti then attacked Buchanan for attacking Swinburne, calling him the poor and pretentious so-called poet Buchanan, unquote. And this is Buchanan, the completely forgotten poet of this debacle. When Buchanan, under an assumed name, then retaliated by attacking William's brother Dante Gabriel in an article called "The Fleshly School of Poetry," nobody was fooled. And Dante Gabriel penned a highly successful riposte entitled "The Stealthy School of Criticism," making fun of Buchanan's use of a nom de plume. Just when everyone thought the dust had settled, Buchanan, under his own name this time, brought out an entire pamphlet called "The Fleshly School of Poetry," devoted to attacking Rossetti. And here we see Rossetti with John Ruskin, arm in arm, literally. And John Ruskin was a major supporter of Rossetti and of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and it helped a great deal to have that kind of support in Victorian England. But it didn't save Rossetti from this villainous attack. Because a major poem in Rossetti's collection, Jenny, is about a prostitute of that name, and narrated by a man who supposedly spends the night chastely chatting with Jenny. Buchanan imputes to Rossetti a supposed morbid Italian tendency to brood over unclean ideas. But Buchanan is cleverer at mind games than at writing his now forgotten poetry. He keeps implying that Rossetti has plagiarized his ideas and techniques from Browning, without, however, possessing Browning's talent. One example of Buchanan on Jenny will do. Quote, "The meter at the opening reminds us of one which Mr. Browning uses with characteristic force, but which in Rossetti's hands degenerates into feeble octosyllabic verse," unquote, and so on for the length of the pamphlet. By the sleight of hand of seeming to take Browning's side against Rossetti, as if the two friends were somehow against each other, Buchanan, in finest dirty tricks political campaign manner, manages to get under the skin of Rossetti, who alarms family and friends by dosing himself with huge quantities of chloral hydrate, an addictive drug classed as a hypnotic, I believe, and took huge quantities of chloral hydrate together with huge quantities of whiskey in order to sleep nights. Then in 1872, Browning sent to his old friend Rossetti a presentation copy of his new major poem, Fifine at the Fair, which Browning considered his most important poem since Sordello. And it too happens to be about a prostitute and is narrated by a man who spends time with the prostitute but who does not remain chaste. Much indicates that Browning had actually been inspired by Jenny to create Fifine, but I believe that Browning was making a purely literary and not a personal point in having his narrator make use of Fifine's favors. He was not conflating any narrators with any actual poets. Poor Rossetti. Highly addictive chloral hydrate induces paranoia. So when he suspiciously reached the closing lines of Fifine at the Fair, in which the narrator bids his wife, should he not return quickly with his possible assignation with Fifine, quote, to slip from flesh and blood and play the ghost again, unquote. His guilty mind took him right back to his wife Lizzie's suicide. His brother William, who was there, said he suddenly threw the book across the room, declaring Browning the leader of a huge conspiracy against him, and that the poem was a compendium of insinuations aimed entirely at him. And here we see Rossetti brooding. For the remaining 10 years of his life, although Browning attempted to reach out numerous times to his old friend, the oldest fan of his poetry, Rossetti never saw or communicated with Browning again, thus bringing one of the Victorian age's great literary friendships to a precipitous end. Postscript. In my callow youth, I read Evelyn Waugh's novel Brideshead Revisited and judged it to be a flawed masterpiece about coincidence, fated love, and the lure of the supernatural. I recently reread it and was floored by a simple phrase I'd originally thought oddly stressed more than once by Waugh in the novel. Quote, "I have been here before." This time around, I recognized "I have been here before" as the opening line of a poem by Rossetti I had never actually read. The poem is called Sudden Light and is about predestined love, and indeed about something like reincarnation and the reuniting of lovers in other lifetimes. And it's not a very long poem, and I'm going to read you Rossetti's Sudden Life. I have been here before, but when or how I cannot tell. I know the grass beyond the door, the sweet keen smell, the sighing sound, the lights around the shore. You have been mine before. How long ago, I may not know. But just when at that swallow's soar, your neck turned so, some veil did fall, I knew it all of yore. Then, now, perchance again, around mine eyes your tresses shake. Shall we not lie as we have lain thus for love's sake, and sleep and wake, yet never break the chain? In this and other poems, I now see that Rossetti is more mysterious than I'd realized, having a deep-seated relationship with the supernatural. In this, he and Warhol again resemble one another, with Warhol's secretive mystical side becoming known only after his death. Rossetti, strange to say, was a mystic in his fleshliness. And it is that, as much as anything, that ultimately cleaved a gulf between himself and Robert Browning, who thought it highly unlikely that a man could resist the charms of Fifine's flesh. Thank you very much. And this final image is Elizabeth Siddal, portrayed shortly after her death by her husband Rossetti as Beatrice from the Divine Comedy.
Let's give a round of applause for Tom, ladies and gentlemen. You're not done yet. You're not done yet. You're not done.
Can I go? I need a drink.
I know. We're going to have a drink soon.
Okay.
We're going to open it up for questions, ladies and gentlemen. What an amazing lecture. We had vampires, we had Frankenstein, we had prostitutes, we had murder, we had deception, we had famous painters and famous writers from the Victorian era. Perfect for our Halloween Eve. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen?